It was a conference reviewing the nuclear non-proliferation treaty, but it turned into theatre with accusations flying this way and that of endangering the world. Are Iran's nuclear ambitions putting humanity at risk? Or are nuclear weapons states such as the US posturing over those who want to develop peaceful nuclear technology? This is Inside Story. Hello there and welcome to the programme. I'm Nick Clark. The nuclear conference currently underway in New York is not supposed to focus solely on concerns over Iran and its nuclear ambitions. It is an event for states that are party to the non-proliferation treaty to follow up or strengthen rules to ensure the system is working. Well, it wasn't like that on Monday. Representatives of the United States, United Kingdom and France all walked out of the UN conference following criticism by the only head of state who attended. That was Iran's President Mahmoud Ahmadinejad. In his speech, he said nuclear weapons were disgusting and shameful and a danger to the countries who have them. While he fleetingly mentioned Israel, most of his speech was directed at the United States.
Regrettably, the United States has not only used nuclear weapons, but also continues to threaten the use of such weapons against other countries, including my country. So one may ask, how much could nations possibly trust the United States to implement its commitments? What guarantees are there that it would live up to such commitments? And what are the tools for independent verification of its guarantees?
Well, there was more. That wasn't his only accusation against the US and indeed the West. Ahmadinejad spoke of double standards, not allowing developing countries access to nuclear technology for peaceful purposes, while superpowers' own programs are far from transparent, he said. He also accused them of failing to take any serious steps towards disarming, despite their announced agreement to do so for many years. Now, on the other hand, the United States, they hit back without directly addressing President Ahmadinejad's views.
Iran will do whatever it can to divert attention away from its own record and to attempt to evade accountability. It has defied the UN Security Council and the IAEA and placed the future of the non-proliferation regime in jeopardy.
Well, Secretary Clinton accused Tehran of putting the world at risk. She urged for a strong international response and said she believes tough new sanctions are the only way to, as she put it, catch Iran's attention. So those are the parameters of our discussion today, and joining us to take it on in Tehran, Syed Mohammed Marandi, head of North American Studies at Tehran University. In Washington, D.C., Richard Weitz, director of the Center for Political Military Analysis at the Hudson Institute. Also in Washington, Gareth Porter, who's an investigative historian and journalist on U.S. national security policy. And Gareth Porter, if I may start with you, what did you make of President Ahmadinejad's speech? Pretty effective?
I think it was an effective speech in the sense that Ahmadinejad really focused in on the issues which he has very good reason to believe will resonate with the majority of the delegations to the NPT review conference. That is to say, the discriminatory nature of the NPT as a regime. And I think that most delegations, I think the vast majority of the delegations in New York are well aware that this regime has not been a regime that has been objective in its approach to nuclear weapons, but has indeed discriminated against certain governments and in favor of others, namely those regimes that have been friendly to the United States and its allies have received favorable treatment and have indeed been allowed to acquire nuclear weapons and to stand outside the NPT, whereas other regimes, and specifically Iran, has been the target of policies which have indeed been discriminatory and which have not been in the spirit in which the NPT was originally negotiated.
Okay, let's put that across to Richard Weitz, also in Washington. The President hit the nail on the head, didn't he? It's true to say that the NPT is discriminatory.
Well, I interpreted the President's speech as consisting of three main elements. First, there was a statement that Iran's nuclear intentions are purely peaceful. It has no desire to attain nuclear weapons. It just wants to engage in peaceful nuclear activities. Second, as was pointed out, another key component was that the NPT and the IAEA and the other structures that are part of the nuclear non-proliferation regime are discriminatory. They allow some countries temporarily to possess nuclear weapons while others are denied that. And then the third component was, as you said, in the introductory package, not so much an attack on Israel, but an attack on the United States. There were statements that the United States is a very aggressive country. It was the only country that used nuclear weapons, and therefore everybody hates those who did it.
But do you think it was an effective speech?
The United States. Well, I listened to the speeches that came the following 2 days, and I did not see any change from what one would have anticipated. I think that if you had to break it down, there's a widespread view that Iran has not necessarily violated the treaty specifically, but it's certainly engaged in activities which are suspicious and needs to be clarified. The second, the discriminatory nature of the regime, I think, is something that does resonate with the majority of the delegates. But that's really, nobody can think of any better arrangement, so by default we sort of accepted that. And the third one, by the accusation of the United States, I didn't notice any change. The kind of countries who support that position seem to support that still,
okay.
But traditional, I did not. So I don't think it had much of an impact on the delegates there.
Okay, yeah, well, let's bring in a Tehran point of view. Mohammad Morandi, the president clearly went to New York with a mission. Did he get what he wanted, do you think, from what he said?
Well, I think one of the important things is to keep in mind is that it was very broadly supported in Iran. Critics of the president as well as his supporters thought it was a very good speech. And at times there are differences in interpretation as to how well he did in his international speeches and in conferences. But on this occasion, it was more or less unanimous. I think that what he was trying to do...
Sorry to interrupt. It did seem to be a little more diluted in rhetoric, perhaps, than normal. Would that be fair?
I would say that it was very specific and to the point. I would say, yes, there was very little rhetoric, and it was very specific in what he was trying to say. In general, I think what he was trying to do was trying to allow or provide an opportunity for the Iranian position to get across to the global community, because after all, the Western media is extraordinarily biased towards Iran, and most people rarely have an opportunity to hear the Iranian version of what's going on. So I think that in that sense he probably did quite well, because there was extensive coverage of his speech in some news channels and outlets. But I also think that it does have an impact on the delegates, because the president actually went there, and it was well received. The audience seemed to like what he had to say. But at the end of the day, Iran's problem is not with the delegates, because after all, the non-aligned movement, which consists of the majority of the countries of the world, as well as the Organization for the Islamic Conference, support Iran's position, and they have in the past. But it is basically the United States and its key allies that are trying to push Iran and trying to create an atmosphere of confrontation. At least that's the Iranian perspective.
And Richard White, so is that what's going on here, trying to create this atmosphere of confrontation?
Well, I wouldn't, we have to be careful. This is a multiple week-long conference. It's going to probably last about a month. I think May 28th is the last day. The opening day speeches, there was some of that, but there's a recognition among the, at least the American team, American experts, that this is really not the function, the best venue to engage in a fight with Iran. So I think that now that the opening speeches are done with the senior level people, President Ahmadinejad has returned back to Iran, Secretary Clinton's gone back to, I believe, Washington or wherever she's traveling. Now the experts will sit down and try and work out how to strengthen the regime, and I think you're going to not see this kind of inflammatory rhetoric in the working group. So I wouldn't draw too much from the opening day speeches. Those are pretty set formats.
So are you saying that this heralds a new era in negotiations and the way forward?
No, there's fundamental problems with the non-proliferation regime. And you've got a bunch of people at the expert level who've been thinking very, very seriously over the last few years, if not decades, about how to strengthen it. And now they're getting together and trying to work out measures that would strengthen it that are acceptable to everybody. And that's very difficult because every country, the tradition is that anything has to be agreed by consensus. So there's a thinking, the U.S. delegation is deliberately trying to play down expectations, saying, well, we'll try and do our best in this avenue, but if not here, there are other mechanisms we can use, better institutions such as the International Atomic Energy itself, the UN Security Council, Nuclear Suppliers Group. So there's a recognition this is going to be very difficult, but there is some hope that under President Obama, because he's got a more clearly adopted disarmament agenda and made other steps to move the U.S. policy in the way that many of the delegates want, they'll see some progress in this area.
Okay, Gareth Porter, I'm interested in this issue of rhetoric and how it seems to have been diluted a little bit, because one person who wasn't diluting it was the Secretary of State, Hillary Clinton, saying that, stating flatly that Iran has flouted the rules of the NPT treaty. But you have to wonder in what way. I mean, they may have pushed the limits a bit, but they haven't flouted the rules as such, have they?
Well, this is a very important distinction that needs to be made, and I'm afraid in terms of news media coverage has very often been missed, I would say almost always been missed. The distinction between Iran's record with regard to the NPT itself and its obligations under that treaty and the obligations which have been created simply by acts of political acts by the United States and its allies through the United Nations Security Council in demanding that Iran simply cease to carry out any uranium enrichment. Now, that's a demand that is not, of course, part of the NPT itself. It is a political demand that reflects the interests of the United States and its allies, and, of course, their hostility toward Iran. And I think that distinction is fundamental. The Iranians try to underline that as much as possible. On the other hand, Hillary Clinton and the U.S. government really try to expunge that distinction or try to erase that distinction in their rhetoric. So it's very important to understand that, that this is part and parcel of the discriminatory nature of this regime. I did a piece last year pointing out that as recently as 2004, the IAEA Governing Council was carrying out a dual or a double standard with regard to the treatment of Iran on one hand and South Korea on the other, despite the fact that they had extraordinarily similar records in terms of their violations of the rules within the IAEA. The only difference being that South Korea was the only country that had enriched to an extremely high level, close to weapons-grade enrichment of uranium, and received hardly even a tap on the wrist, whereas Iran was treated as a major miscreant.
Let me just, I want to bring in Mohammed Morandi in a second, but let me just throw that back to Richard Weitz just to respond to that, first of all.
Well, there are some technical disagreements between the IAEA and Iran about what Iran needs to do to make sure it's in compliance with the safeguards. For example, there was that revelation about the site at Qum. The IAEA says they should have been notified in advance. The uranium position was only when they introduced nuclear materials into the site, should they. More broadly, the reason why the Security Council has sanctioned Iran multiple times, and includes Russia and China, which aren't necessarily U.S. allies, is that there's a concern that Iran hasn't been fully forthcoming in all its activities, and therefore there's a question about whether they truly are peaceful. And the Security Council and others have said, well, Iran can make steps to demonstrate this. For example, it can ratify the additional protocol, which gives the agency additional inspection rights, and so on. And until then, it should stop its enrichment. And Iran has not followed the resolutions, and so you're seeing increasing sanctions.
Okay, okay, let me bring in Mohammed Morandi.
You might see enrichment allow. Okay, all right.
Okay, just make that point very quickly.
I was going to say that in terms of when you see a final compromise, if you see a final compromise, it might allow, I think what you might see is Iran being allowed to continue uranium enrichment, but under very clear, transparent monitoring to make sure it's not at the nuclear weapon stage. But we haven't reached that level where you're going to see that trade-off yet in terms of the negotiations.
Well, Mohammed Morandi said, whatever, tougher sanctions are coming sooner or later, and it's only going to get harder and harder for Iran.
Well, one point that I should state is that the Iranians did apply the additional protocol voluntarily for over 2 years, and they got nothing in return. In fact, a lot of the inspections that were being carried out throughout the country were on sites that had nothing to do with Iran's nuclear program, and they were carried out in areas which had military installations, and the Iranians were aware that the information was being fed to the Americans. So on the one hand, they got nothing from those extensive and intrusive inspections. There was no evidence ever to show that Iran's program was anything but peaceful, but the Americans were effectively gathering intelligence on Iran as a result. Whether new sanctions are imposed upon Iran or not, the Iranians are adamant that they will continue the nuclear program because it is peaceful. There is no evidence to show it to be anything otherwise, and the Iranian public would demand that of the Iranian government. The Iranian government really cannot back down.
All right. Having said that, so what do you say to when you hear this U.S. administration saying that all options are on the table when it comes to encouraging Iran to bow to international pressure? What do you assess all options to mean, and how would Iran respond to that?
Well, I think that is a very important point. Iranians, initially when Obama came to power, many Iranians were hopeful that there would be change in Washington. But all options on the table effectively means that there is a threat for war and military action and murder and death and destruction. And also the nuclear posture review, which came out, and Iran was effectively threatened with nuclear weapons, although Iranians know that the Americans could never carry that out. But still, the Iranians felt very offended and insulted, and they thought it was very outrageous. So I think Obama has really lost his credibility in the country, and it only further not only alienates the Iranian government, but it forces the Iranian government to take a more hardline position, because Iranians, after all, will be expecting any new and additional pressure on the country to be for the Iranian government to respond to that and to make life more difficult for the Americans and its allies as well.
Okay, let's throw that straight across to Washington.
Sanctions can only make things worse.
Let's throw it straight across to Washington. Richard Weitz, what do you say to that?
Well, just to clarify, what the Obama administration's position is, they made an effort at outreach. They tried to open up channels to work out some kind of compromise, and they were rebuffed, perhaps due to the elections. We know because of the problems there. The nuclear posture review, that's an important point too. The administration, what they did was, before the previous review, nuclear policy in the United States, was we could theoretically use nuclear weapons against a large number of countries. And they basically stripped most of those away. So if a country attacks us with chemical weapons, we're not going to respond with nuclear weapons. I mean, we probably wouldn't have it anyway, but they kept this option open. There's a loophole that says we will not, the only countries we might theoretically attack with nuclear weapons are those that already have nuclear weapons, and those that are not fulfilling their non-proliferation obligations, which means they could have nuclear weapons. But the all options, I interpret that more as if Iran is thought to have a nuclear warhead. You see a missile being loaded up, being aimed at Israel. The Americans might try and use an airplane to destroy it before it was launched. I don't anticipate a major military campaign such as you saw against Saddam Hussein.
Gareth Porter?
Yes, I would just say that I think one point that's being missed here is the obvious linkage between the nuclear option that has been retained with regard to Iran and the continuing threat by Israel to attack Iran's nuclear facilities.
Right, I was just coming to that.
A possibility that the Obama administration has carefully failed to state that it would not allow to take place, and an attack which could not effectively take place without the cooperation of the Obama administration. And so I've written a story suggesting that there is indeed an inherent linkage between those two things. Now, the other thing that must be borne in mind is that this continued threat of the possible use of nuclear weapons against Iran is a fundamental violation of the bargain that was reached in 1995 within the NPT. It's a blatant violation of the spirit of the NPT and a violation of the understanding that was reached in 1995. And what it shows is that the United States has no interest in and no intention of dropping its use of the threat of nuclear weapons for political purposes. This is a blatant use of the threat of nuclear weapons, the use of nuclear weapons,
we're running out of time.
A political diplomatic purpose.
Forgive me, we're running out of time. Mohammed Marandi, ultimately, though, we come back to how Iran has been acting in recent months and recent years, and isn't that ultimately the problem with what's happened here, that has enabled a lack of traction to take place in terms of moving this process forward?
No, I think that the Iranians have been quite open. As I said, they applied the additional protocol and they got nothing in return. I would disagree with what was said before about Obama reaching out to Iran. Obama made some statements, but he never did anything in reality. And the Iranian leader, he said that if the United States changes, Iran will change in response. But the United States really never took any real action. In fact, when President Ahmadinejad was making his speech, the American and British and French delegations walked out, which was shows that their fists are clenched. But when the American Secretary of State spoke, the Iranian delegation stayed put. So I think it shows that it's the Iranians who are willing to move towards rapprochement and compromise if its rights are recognized. But on the other side, it's the United States that is behaving, in the eyes of Iranians, in an irrational and hostile fashion towards the country.
Richard White, what's your response to that?
Well, the administration last year did make a series of gestures trying to engage in direct negotiations, or letters from President Obama to the leaders of Iran. There were speeches. There was an offer, in particular, for nuclear collaboration, where the famous effort to try and exchange Iran's low-enriched uranium for reprocessed higher enriched uranium that could not be used for nuclear weapons. And none of those worked, and we can argue particularly why. So starting this year, the administration has shifted more towards we need to use sanctions because the negotiating track has failed. And so that's where we're at present.
But then why would Hillary Clinton use words like Iran has absolutely flatly flouted the rules when it clearly hasn't?
Right, she didn't say that. She was very careful about the way she phrased it. She said that they were not in compliance with the board of what the IAEA has said that Iran needs to do. They're currently the only government that's not in compliance. She didn't say flatly that Iran is pursuing nuclear weapons, because we don't know. The evidence is ambiguous.
Okay, Gareth Porter, a central goal, of course, of the NPT is disarmament. Do you think disarmament is the ultimate aim of this, or is curbing proliferation?
Well, this really goes to the heart of the broader challenge to the regime, which I think is going to produce really another instance in which the delegations are going to be unable to reach common ground in the end of this conference, and that is that the supposed end is supposed to be that the United States and other nuclear powers are going to have a plan to give up their nuclear weapons. And the reality, of course, is that certainly this country has no intention of doing that. It's making plans decades into the future for its nuclear weapons. And that is simply at odds with the NPT's basic goal.
Okay, gents, that's it. We've run out of time. It is an ever-moving ball game, this one, but that's all we've got time for right now. Mohammed Marandi, Richard White, and Gareth Porter, thanks very much indeed, all of you, for your offerings to this programme. And thanks for watching us here on this edition of Inside Story. Do send in your thoughts, your comments and suggestions. Just email them to us. InsideStory@aljazeera.net is the address. From me, Nick Clark, it's goodbye.